Today I'm going to talk to you about the organ's acoustical design, about its pipes, their different sounds, and a central question, why does it have so many? Our sanctuary pipe organ at Lakewood Presbyterian, which is not a large organ, it's not small, but it's definitely medium-sized in the world of organs, has 2,212 pipes. That's a lot of metal and wood bits, and you might wonder, why do we need so many? The first reason I'm going to talk about has to do with the harmonic series, the acoustical properties of sound produced by strings or pipes and how they have different harmonics, and how organ builders have used the harmonic series and its properties to design an instrument that reinforces different parts of the harmonics. So let's do a little bit of acoustical physics first before we look at some actual pipes.
I'm going to use this ukulele to demonstrate how the harmonic series works, because the original theoreticians used a vibrating string to posit the series. Now, we're going to take this string here. It goes from the top of the fretboard to the bottom here, which is a little whale, and it sounds like this. Full-length string. That's called the fundamental. If we make it into halves, half is here, half is here, that's the first note on the harmonic series, and it is an octave higher. So here, you can hear that. If I'm going to divide this original string in the length of thirds, 1/3 is here, 2/3 is this longer part, that is an octave and a fifth higher. Here's the original one. If I take the string, divide it in half, as we already heard, an octave higher, divide this part in half again, another octave higher. So full length, fundamental, half, 1 octave. This is a quarter of the original string, 2 octaves. So now we know the first 3 notes of the harmonic series are half the length of string is an octave higher, 1/3 of the length of string is octave and a fifth higher, and 1/4 of the length of the string is 2 octaves higher. You can kind of hear, if you do a fifth, it's 1/3 higher than that. And actually that gives you the 3 notes of the major triad, and that is part of why the major triad is the basis of music across the world. Western music and many other folk musics are based on it because it has this natural resonance that's connected to mathematical properties of a string.
Now, as that string vibrates, whatever its length, it is vibrating as a full string. It is vibrating with a wave that has a node at 1/2. It's vibrating as a wave that has node at 1/3. A wave with nodes at a 4th, a 5th, a 6th, a 7th, etc. At each of those nodes, you're going to get the overtone, it's called, that note in the harmonic series that we just explored. So the string will be playing a certain pitch, but part of that pitch is the octave above, the octave and fifth above, the 2 octaves above, the 2 octaves and a third above, etc. And so each tone color is made up of different strengths of those different overtones, or harmonics they're called. That's why a clarinet sounds different from a saxophone. It's why a piano string sounds different from a guitar string. They have different overtone compositions. The organ is built on the theory that instead of just having your fundamental, your original string length, you can add pipes that match the harmonics of that original and reinforce them, and they'll combine together to make a sound that sounds like just one pitch, but is actually made up of different lengths of pipes emphasizing different harmonics of the original pipe. So you can have a pipe that's the original length, and you can add to it a pipe half that length, and add to that a pipe 1/4 of its length, and it combines together to make one sound. Now that you have some idea of the acoustical theory that the organ is based on, it's time to meet some actual pipes here at Lakewood Presbyterian. You'll notice we have 3 keyboards and 1 pedal board for my feet. This one is called the swell. Its pipes are behind me up there. This one is called the grate. The pipes are over there. This one is called the positive. The pipes are over there, and the pedal pipes are also over there. So most of the pipes of our organ are on the lectern side of our church. Now the numbers on each of these stop tabs, all of these white things right here, tell you what pitch the pipe is at, just like the harmonic series. The kind of base pitch of the organ is called 8 foot, the fundamental pitch, where the pipe that corresponds to the lowest note on the keyboard, this C, 2 octaves below middle C, is theoretically 8 feet tall. In practice, it might not be exactly 8 feet, but it's about 8 feet tall. So here we have an 8-foot tall pipe. A 4-foot tall pipe, half of that is of course an octave higher. A 2-foot tall pipe, 1/4 of the original, is of course 2 octaves higher. On other keyboards, we have some of the harmonics that are not at the octave, which makes the organ particularly fun. Because if you think of an orchestra, different instruments might be playing things in octaves. Like the piccolo might be an octave higher than the flutes. What an orchestra doesn't do, except maybe in extraordinary circumstances, is have an instrument double a different one, not in an octave, at like a 5th. So here, on this lower keyboard, we have a fun example of one of the harmonics that is being doubled on the organ that is not at the octave. You have your 8-foot. This is middle C. You have your 4-foot. You have your 2-foot, 2 octaves higher. Now, I'm going to add a pair of pipes. I can't separate them because they're designed on this organ to always be played together. One of them is 1 octave and a 5th higher. So from this fundamental, that would be that note, 1 octave and a 5th higher. And one of them is 2 octaves and a 3rd higher, which is that note. Here I pulled them on together. Now, breaking them apart like that, you can hear their separate notes. It's designed to be used 8, 4, 2, and that together. When you hear it played in a melody, your ear isn't saying, oh wow, I hear the 3rd and the 5th being played way above that fundamental. Your ear hears it as one sound. But you can hear, if you compare that to taking it away, how different the tone color is. So it really is about timbre, and it's almost like changing the instrument that you're using. A clarinet versus a saxophone versus a flute, they might be able to play a lot of the same pitches, but they sound really different because the design of those instruments, the metal they're made of, the way they're shaped, affects the harmonics that are prominent or less prominent, and so you get a different tone color. Here on the organ, you're doing that, kind of building it yourself. Our swell division also has one of those. 8-foot, 4-foot, 2-foot, 2 octaves and a 5th. So you can really hear that 5th come on and off if I make a point of it. Again, if I play it with music, just a melody, you're not going to notice that it's there. And you can use it for chords. In fact, the full organ sound that you think of when you think organ has those 5ths in it. The 3rd is a little more specialized, but those 5ths are part of the design. Like on our full organ here sounds. If I take away the 5ths, it has a really different color. And so they're pretty integral to the organ sound. So here we have a wooden pipe. It's called a stopped pipe. It has a nice long foot. It goes through this top board, which just holds them in place, down to where it connects to the wind supply. Just like a recorder, it has a little hole right here and a little place for the air to come out. This one has a little metal thing, wooden thing on the top covering it, and it sounds like this. If I blow it harder, it might change pitch a little bit, but it's not going to be able to play different notes. So I'll try and see what noises I can make with it. So there's kind of a range of a couple different notes. The organ is set at a certain wind pressure to make the note that you want it to play. And there's nothing you can do to change that note or to really change the volume much. If you change, when I blew harder, the note changed. So each of these pipes here can only play at one volume. So if you want to change volume, make the organ louder or softer, you have to do it by playing more pipes, that's louder, or fewer pipes, that's softer, and choosing which pipes you play. So here we have two pipes. They are next door pipes in this row of pipes. You'll notice they look a little bit different. If you're thinking of the laws of physics, you might think this one is longer, this one should be lower. But in fact, this one is open at the top, and this one is closed at the top. So this one is, in fact, the lower pipe. So these are metal, similar in construction to the wooden ones, but they have a slightly different tone. It's pretty subtle. Now, how would you tune a pipe like this? You would move this little part, this little hat, up or down slightly. In the case of these guys, they have a little metal part at the top that actually slides. Now here you can see the bigger pipes in that set I just played you, one that was capped and one that wasn't from. And one of the advantages of capping your pipes here with a cover on the top that will make the pipe much lower than if you didn't have the cover is that you don't need as much metal. You don't have to make as tall a pipe. It also affects the tone color some. The other tone color is kind of different from the normal organ sound, this is the normal, the principal sound or the flute sound. The other one is the reed pipes. Here we have the other major kind of organ pipe. It's called a reed pipe because it makes sound the same way that a clarinet or saxophone would make sound. In that case, there's a reed from a plant that is vibrating against a little open hole. In this case, inside of this part of it, there's a metal reed, and it vibrates against an opening. So it works on the same principle as a clarinet mouthpiece, but you don't have to get the reed wet like wind players do. This little pin right here controls how long the vibrating metal part is. So to tune it, you hit this up or down. And I have actually a butter knife at the keyboard for this very purpose. They make tuning rods which are longer, a little more accurate pieces of metal that organ tuners use. I don't happen to have one, but just using a knife, you can tap this up or down just a very little bit if this goes out of tune. And this is the kind of pipe that most often goes out of tune. Now it makes a somewhat buzzier sound. Let's see if I can do this. Beautiful. I don't know the right wind pressure, but sounds kind of like a dying duck. When the organ plays it, it's more beautiful, and actually there are pipes like this. In some organs you'll see them coming out horizontally, like in the back of the church, all fancy, and those are built on the exact same principle as a foghorn. We have a reed on each keyboard here, which is fortunate because they really have a different tone color. They really stand out in a nice way when you're pairing them with other stops, and they make the instrument a lot more versatile. So here's our swell reed. It's called a shalmi. That's basically trying to say an oboe. It's a little out of tune. Our organ's going to be tuned next week. And the reed pipes are the ones that are most sensitive to going out of tune from temperature changes. So that's just how they are. Here's a trumpet. Now, this doesn't exactly sound like a live trumpet, but it's the organ version of a trumpet. Very nicely demonstrating how it's going out of tune. You can hear that one's a little bit louder. So the trumpet on the grate is more useful for, say, leading a verse of a hymn. I often use it to take the melody of the hymn and make it more prominent. Without it there, the melody doesn't come out quite as well. On our lower keyboard, the reed is called a crumhorn, and that is actually a Renaissance, medieval Renaissance reed instrument. Has a pretty nasal sound. This particular organ is designed in a Baroque influenced fashion, and crumb horns were quite common in the Baroque period in Germany on organs, and so we have one here. It's quieter than the other reeds, but it's still a really nice tone color. And if you hear that compared with a flute, they're really different. So if on one keyboard you put some flutes, and on the other keyboard you play a reed, it really stands out. You can also play flutes on one keyboard and flutes on another keyboard. You can hear they're a little bit different. It allows you to be playing kind of in the same range with different sounds that are similar. So that's a nice possibility. These are our lowest pedal notes against the wall here, these ones made of wood. And you'll see, here's some smaller ones I'm right next to, they have something covering the top here. So that means this pipe is about twice as low as it would be if it didn't have this top covering on it. So you don't need as much wood. These back pipes are still almost big enough for a person to get inside. This one is about 10 inches wide there. Other organs, bigger organs, might have pipes that are even taller. Here's our very tallest pipes. I'm standing right by my feet, and they go up about 16 feet to the top there for the largest ones. So those are not capped. That's the longest pipes that we have here at Lakewood. But some other larger organs would have ones that go up to 32 feet tall, so twice as low as these. They're not essential for organ music, but they can add color and just gravitas to the sound when you have a really big full instrument. So these pipes are still pretty big. You can see why organs are so expensive, in particular the pedal parts, just because of the sheer quantity of metal and wood needed to make these pipes. Since you need one per note, that's a lot of resources. Now the pedal gets to have notes that are lower than the fundamental. Sometimes you find these on keyboards too. We only have one on this organ on keyboards because it's a smaller instrument, but you pretty much always have them on the pedal. So here's the fundamental. This is the C below middle C. And the pedal has pipes that are not just 8 feet, but 16 feet. Twice as long means twice as low. You're not going to hear it that well if you're listening on a phone or a computer, because low noises don't, they aren't supported by the speakers on phones and computers very well. If you're not using real speakers, the low tones on all of our church recordings aren't going to come through very well, and the organ really depends on those low tones. It really anchors the sound and gives the bass note a gravitas. You might hear it better with the reed. We have a 16-foot reed on the pedal, which I often use for the last verse of a hymn or something, just to give it a little more oomph. Here's the 8. So if we do full organ here, that's without the pedal reed. That's with it. So you can really hear it cuts through even when everything else is on. It just helps the pedal line come out, it helps ground the sound, and the organ is really based on having a full bass, which compositionally was something that happened in the Baroque period with the basso continuo. The bass note, the bass line, the bass giving the harmony became musically really important then. I'm going to give you a short explanation of the organ shoes. If you've ever seen me walking around church in these gold shoes, which are a little scuffed up just because I use them so much, you might have wondered why. They don't seem to match my usual style. So they're designed to have a really thin, flexible sole made of leather and a small heel. They're a lot like jazz dance shoes. In fact, I know some organists who don't want to buy these. They're called
Organ Master, the brand for organists, who use jazz dance shoes instead. And the reason for that design is the thin, kind of narrow toe and the soft leather means that you can slide your foot on the pedals. A rubber sole would get stuck. You never play the organ with street shoes. If for some reason I'm ever in a situation where I don't have my organ shoes, I will play with socks rather than any other shoe. They just don't work. So that allows you to really feel where you are on the pedal board and also slide around. The heel lets you play, let's get some sound on, lets you play one note and then the next note by lifting your foot up and down like that. So you can play a scale with just one foot by just alternating your toe and your heel. If you didn't have this little lift for your heel, it would be a lot harder to do just because of ergonomics. The heel also lets you play two notes without hitting the one in between. So you can play a third. You can theoretically play 4 notes at once with your feet. And there are pieces written only for the feet that exploit that. You can also do a glissando because they're so soft. Not super useful except in the occasional pedal solo piece that has a dramatic moment. And it really just helps you bounce around the keyboard, know where you are, be able to play notes by dividing between your feet, dividing between your toe and your heel, and it just gives you a lot more flexibility. A couple of minutes ago, I showed you on an organ pipe how if you blow it harder or with less force, it doesn't change the dynamic of the pipe, it just changes the pitch a little bit. Unlike in a piano, where if you press the key harder, it plays it louder, and you press it softer, it plays it quieter, an organ pipe only makes one volume of sound. So each pipe only plays one note, and it only plays it at one volume. So organ builders have devised a clever system to give you some control over dynamics without having to change the pipes you're using. These are what are called swell shades, these pieces of wood. And they open and close. Right now they're open. So that's how you can have dynamics on the organ without being able to change the dynamics of individual pipes. You put them inside a box. You have openings in the box, and these openings also go out to the sanctuary proper, as well as above where the choir would be. When the shades are closed, the sound that you get out in the room is less, and as the shades open, the sound gets louder. So this is really the only way that organ builders have come up with to change the sound of a set of pipes without changing its timbre by adding or subtracting sets of pipes. Here you have a look down below at what controls those swell shades. This is called a swell pedal. You close it to close the shades, and you open it to open the shades. So here we have stuff in there, it's closed. That's as much dynamic contrast as you get. This pedal on the right is what's called a crescendo pedal, and it has a preset list of stops that it adds on in the order that the manufacturer decided. So if I hold down a chord here and nothing's on, and I slowly open this, it'll go stop by stop. Of limited usefulness, since you never know quite when something's going to come on or off, and it's easier and more controlled to use these toe studs or to use, here's a close-up of what they look like under the keyboard, these little guys with your hand. So while you're playing, you can reach your thumb under and hit one, in theory. So you have to practice changing the sounds of the organ just as much as you have to practice the actual notes. So I'm standing about halfway down the sanctuary aisle, and of course we're looking at the front of the church, and the organ pipes are located in those lattice work wooden things with black screen behind them on either side of the front of the church. Now, many organists say the most important part of the organ is not actually the organ itself, but the room that the organ is in. And how the organ pipes are designed, where they're put in the room, makes a really big difference in how the organ speaks into the room and how it sounds to people sitting out in the congregation. So here at LPC, we actually have a really ideal way of having the pipes be in the room. They are hidden. They're kind of behind these screens, which don't affect the sound, but they're not buried behind the walls. In many churches, instead of having the pipes built out into the room, they'd be in chambers back in the walls so that there wasn't anything coming out into the room. And then, of course, a lot of the sound would be lost in the wall and it wouldn't come out into the church. So here we have a case where the pipes are actually in the church building. If they're going to reflect off the organ chamber walls, they're going to come right out toward the congregation, as well as there's lattice on either side and screens so that the organist, the pastor, the choir, anyone sitting up front can hear the organ equally as well. I'm going to close today with a little history about our sanctuary organ, which was built by the Holtkamp Organ Company, a Cleveland company that actually was one of the most influential in the organ reform movement in the United States across the 20th century. The organ reform movement grew out of a desire to be able to play the music of J.S. Bach and his contemporaries with more clarity and more authenticity. The organs of the late 19th century and early 20th century were symphonic in conception. They were really great for playing orchestral transcriptions of Wagner, for instance. They had lots of different sounds at the same pitch, and they could do a lot of dynamic shadings that we can't do here on this Holtkamp organ. The symphonic organ was not great for contrapuntal music like that of Bach and other Baroque composers, with the pipes buried back in the walls and sometimes even then covered with thick curtains to muffle their sound more. They didn't speak clearly enough into the room, and the pipes were not designed in such a way to support Baroque music. In Germany in the 1920s, an organ reform movement began, and that spilled over to the United States. Builders like Walter Holtkamp, who was one of the generations of Holtkamps who have run the Holtkamp Organ Company, traveled to Germany to see historic instruments, hear them, study their design, and try to re-envision how the organ could be built in the United States. Now, of course, all of the old historic German organs are mechanical. I talked last week some about the difference between mechanical organs and those that use electromagnets to open and close the airways that let air into the pipes. In the early 20th century, all American organs were electronic, fully electronic. But of course, that wasn't possible in the Baroque. Walter Holtkamp and others were very struck by the mechanical instruments and wanted to return to that aesthetic. And here's a picture of an organ of his from 1936 to 1938, we're not exactly sure when, possibly the first mechanical instrument built by an American builder. But the United States culture and aesthetics weren't ready for mechanical instruments. So he stopped his vision of trying to build mechanical instruments and instead focused on other aspects of design. One of the things that he and other reform builders did was take the pipes not only out from behind the wall, but completely out. Here is perhaps a familiar instrument. If you've been to the Cleveland Art Gallery, this is in their auditorium. This is a landmark instrument by Holtkamp, and you can see the pipes are fully visible. They're not in chambers at all, except on the right-hand side. You can see those swell shades are open, and that's just to give a little bit of dynamic expression to those pipes, right? Everything else is exposed and visible and speaks very clearly into the room. The organ at LPC is the last one designed by Walter Holtkamp Sr., who was the pioneer of the organ reform movement. It was finished by his son, Walter Holtkamp Jr., who was equally influential in organ building. Over the course of the 60s and 70s, Walter Holtkamp Jr. was able to realize his father's dream of bringing mechanical action to the United States. Here's a picture of a church in New York City, a Walter Holtkamp Jr. organ. And you can see, if you compare it to this picture of a historic instrument from Europe, how similar they look in terms of case layout and groups of pipes and little towers. The history of organ building has been so long and so varied,
with organs being built in different styles over many centuries in different parts of the world, that it's impossible for one organ to play all organ music equally well. And each organ has a specific stylistic influence and repertoire that it plays best. Our organ here in this sanctuary, because of its influence from the North German Baroque, is particularly suited for Baroque music and also American music of the 20th century. It's not so suited for music from the 19th century or other transcriptions of, say, orchestral works. Our organ in the chapel takes this North German Baroque influence even farther. It's purely mechanical except for the blower. Everything does not use electricity. And the stops, although there are fewer, are crafted more closely based on how the pipes would have been made in a Baroque instrument. They're very beautiful sounding. The organ is limited because there's so few of them. There's no pipes behind swell shades, so there's no dynamic possibilities to change within a piece. You just have what you put on at the beginning, and that's what you have. So it's very beautiful sounding, but it's also limited. It also is great for Baroque music, perhaps even better for Baroque music than the sanctuary instrument because it does have a more authentic sound. So now you know a little bit about the complexity of sounds that go into organ music, how they're based on the harmonic series, the whole idea of combining pipes of different lengths and pitches to build your own tone color, and just a little bit about the complicated history that went into organ building and how our organs here at Lakewood Presbyterian are influenced by the organ reform movement of the 20th century in America.